Hello, everyone. For this video recording, we're going to be talking about the anatomical terminology and the body planes. Anatomical terminology is very, very important. It's important to know how to communicate with other anatomists or other medical professionals or health professionals so that when you discuss the observations that you made of a patient, everybody will be able to understand. So, for example, if you discovered a new continent, how would you begin collecting information so that you could report your findings? You would have to construct a detailed map of the territory. The completed map would contain, for example, prominent landmarks such as mountains, valleys, volcanoes, the distance between them, the direction you travel to get from one place to another. The distances might be recorded in miles or kilometers, and the directions recorded as compass bearings north, south, east, west. With such a map, anyone could go directly to a specific location on that continent. So, this is why it's important to have a standard anatomical terminology to make communication between all the different health professionals efficient. It's important to understand that there are still a few new anatomical terms that continue to appear as new technology advances, but many of the older words and phrases remain in use. Most of them come from Latin and Greek words and phrases, and they will form the basis of this impressive number of anatomical terms. So, for example, a Latin name assigned to a specific structure 2,000 years ago are still in use today. That's why I think it's important when you're studying anatomy and physiology for you to pay attention to those terms and try to understand what they mean, and then you're not trying to memorize the terms and you're understanding why these structures got the name that they received. In terms of language of anatomy, a few things to keep in mind that are common are, for example, superficial anatomy, which means that it's the anatomical landmark and the correct directional terms that help in understanding the underlying structure. So you will have a specific landmark and a directional term that you can pinpoint where these structures are located. In terms of anatomical landmarks, we can have a person that's standing in an anatomical position. We're going to see on the next slide how the anatomical position is. This is a specific position where the individual is standing upright, the arms are at the side, and the palms are facing forward, together with the feet being flat on the floor and also facing straight ahead. In terms of an individual that's laying down, it can be either in a supine or prone position. The way that I remember how to differentiate the two is that supine has the up word, so it means that a person is laying down but with the face facing up. And the prone position, the person is laying down but with the face down. This is the image that I mentioned when I was talking about an individual being in an anatomical position. You can observe on this image how this individual is standing up. The palms are to the side, facing forward, with the thumb being lateral compared to the pinky, and the feet are also flat on the floor facing forward. So this is your typical anatomical position. Keep in mind that when we observe structures, especially in the books, that they should be in anatomical position or referenced in anatomical position. I'm going to use the same image to talk about the different body parts and body regions. Here we have several different terms. Some are more common terms. For example, like mouth, I'm sure you guys have heard of. The skull, I'm sure you guys have heard of. The cheek, you guys have heard of. So these are all structures that you have heard of, but they also receive specific names that come more from either Latin or Greek, and those are important for you to know. So some of them that are important for you to know are, for example, the brachium, which is referencing to the arm, which is just this top part of the upper limb. The antebrachium is this part over here, which is referencing the forearm. Same thing down here, you're going to have the thigh, which is referencing this top part of the lower limb. And then down here, this is what we call the leg, which is referencing the crus. So these are some of the anatomical parts that you need to know, and we will discuss them throughout the semester so you will get more familiar with them. And also you will do an activity that has to do with the more specific terms that I need you to know so that you can practice them. One last thing that I would like to add to this image is this region right over here, which is called the dorsum. And it's not on your slide, but it's definitely an important region. And I would say that the dorsum is superior to the lumbus, for example. When analyzing your body through these techniques that we have talked about in our learning outcome number 1, so there are specific visual techniques that are used to see the internal organs for us to be able to know exactly where these organs are located. We use 3 main anatomical planes. The 3 main anatomical planes are what we call the sagittal, the frontal, which can also be called coronal, or the transverse, which can also be called horizontal. Now the sagittal, if it's right down the middle over here, can also receive a term, specific term of mid-sagittal. And the mid-sagittal is going to divide the body into even right and left sides. Now you can do a sagittal cut that's a little bit more, let's say, to the right, and therefore you're still dividing the body into right and left, but now it's not even, it's uneven. And for this term, we call it a parasagittal. So mid-sagittal is when it's divided evenly right down the middle into right and left. And parasagittal, it's when it's either a little bit more to the right or a little bit more to the left, but it's not right down the middle. Now the transverse plane or horizontal plane, it doesn't really matter where it is as long as it's on this plane right over here. So you're dividing into a superior portion and an inferior portion. And the frontal or coronal plane is going to be like a crown on top. So you're dividing it into anterior and posterior, or ventral and dorsal. So these are interchangeable terms. Here we have directional terms, which I mentioned some of them on the previous slide, but these are going to be paired directional terms, and they're always going to be opposite to each other. So for example, I did mention how the horizontal section, which will cut the body this way, which is also the transverse section, is going to separate the body into a superior portion and an inferior portion. Notice how both of these terms are opposite to each other. Then I also mentioned on the previous slide anterior and posterior, or ventral and dorsal. So for you to have an interior and posterior, or ventral and dorsal, you're going to be doing what we call a coronal section, dividing into anterior or posterior, and then ventral or dorsal. With regards to cranial and caudal, these have to do more with the torso area. So cranial means that it's going towards the cranium, so the head on top, and caudal means that it's going more towards the tail, for cauda, tail, so more further towards the buttocks. You can also divide the body into left and right. So if you do a sagittal section right over here, you're going to have a left side and a right side. With regards to medial and lateral, these are referred in relationship to the midline. So structures that are closer to the midline are going to be considered medial, and structures that are further away from the midline are going to be considered lateral. Now, proximal and distal are a little bit hard, but if you keep in mind that you can only use proximal and distal when you're talking either about the upper limb or the lower limb, then it's going to be easier. So proximal is always referring to the terms that are closer to the torso with relationship to the upper or lower limbs. So for example, this area over here, which is your axilla, is going to be proximal or closer to the torso than, for example, your wrist. Now, if you want to use distal, you can say that your wrist is going to be distal to your axilla. Same thing for the lower limb. So if you're talking about areas that are closer to the torso, they're going to be proximal. If you're talking about areas further away from the torso, then they're going to be distal. And we're going to have some examples on the next slide. So here on this slide, we have the terms that we talked about, and then maybe there are a few more, but they're easier for you to understand, like superficial, meaning that it's towards the surface of the body, and deep, meaning that it's deep down in the body, so not as superficial. As you can see, they're opposite to each other. And I gave some sentences here giving you examples. On the next slide, we're going to go over these examples so that you can understand how to use these directional terms. So here are the sentences from the previous slide. We can go over them one by one. Here we're saying that the lungs are going to be superior to the pancreas. So let's locate the lungs on these images. Here is the lung. And I'm saying that the lung is going to be superior to the pancreas. While the pancreas, you can see a little bit of the pancreas over here because it's right behind the stomach. So it is true that the lungs are superior, so on top of the pancreas. Now let's look at the second example. The liver is inferior to the heart. So let's locate the liver, which is right over here, and let's locate the heart, which is right over here. So it is true that the liver is going to be inferior or further down compared to the heart. Now let's use another sentence. The heart is cranial to the urinary bladder. So let's look at the heart right over here. Down here is your urinary bladder. Remember, cranial means closer to the cranium, right? So on top. So the heart is cranial compared to the urinary bladder. So that's also correct. The next one will be the sacrum is caudal to the lumbar vertebrae. So these are bones. Let's look on this slide right over here. This would be your sacrum. And these last five over here are going to be your lumbar vertebrae. So it is true, caudal meaning closer to the tail, right? So the sacrum is caudal, further down compared to the lumbar vertebrae. So that's also correct. Now let's go to the next one. The trachea is anterior to the vertebrae. So let's locate the trachea. Here is the trachea on this image, and the vertebrae is going to run behind. You can see a little bit of it here, and you can see all of it over here. So the trachea is going to be anterior, so in the front, compared to the vertebrae. So that will be also correct. Now let's look at the next one. The heart is posterior to the sternum. So where is the sternum? The sternum is right over here. And the heart is going to be inside of the rib cage. Therefore, the sternum will be right over here on top of the heart. So we can definitely say that the heart is going to be posterior, so behind the sternum. So that's correct. Let's go to the next one. The stomach is ventral to the pancreas. Remember that ventral can also be called anterior. And the way that I remember is that anterior starts with an A and ventral starts with a V. So you have an A and a V. And then remember that I said dorsal is the same as posterior. So similar to anterior and ventral, we can say that posterior starts with a P and dorsal starts with a D. So if we can do like a little line, they look similar, the posterior and the dorsal. So that's how I remember the ventral goes with anterior and the dorsal goes with posterior. So let's go back here to the sentences. The spinal cord is dorsal, so posterior to the inferior vena cava. So let's locate the spinal cord. The spinal cord is going to be located right down here behind, and the superior vena cava is right over here. So definitely the spinal cord is running behind the superior vena cava, or even the inferior vena cava. So that is also correct. Let's go to the next one. The heart is medial to the lungs. Definitely. Remember, medial means closer to the midline. So the heart is right over here on the midline, and the lungs are lateral to the heart. So the heart is medial to the lungs, or the lungs are lateral to the heart. So that is correct. Now let's go to the next one. The fibula is lateral to the tibia. So this is the fibula right over here, and this is the tibia. So yes, the fibula is lateral to the tibia, or the tibia is medial, closer to the midline compared to the fibula. So that is true as well. Let's go to the next one, which is the femur is proximal to the tibia. So this is your femur, and this is your tibia. So the proximal means closer to the torso, right? So the femur is proximal, so closer to the torso compared to the tibia. So yes, that's correct. Now let's do the next one. The carpals are distal to the humerus. So carpals are your wrist bones right over here, and the humerus is the bone that forms your arm. So the carpals are distal, so further away from the torso compared to the humerus. That is correct as well. Now let's do the next one. The sternum is superficial to the heart. Yes, the sternum is right over here and the heart is underneath it. So the sternum is going to be superficial to the heart. And last one is the stomach is deep to the rectus abdominis. So your rectus abdominis is your abs that will be covering all of this. And we can see that the stomach is right over there underneath, right over here. So we can definitely say that the stomach is going to be deep compared to the rectus abdominis, which is your abs, your six-pack that covers everything. So that being said, we covered all your directional terms right over here. So make sure that you understand these sentences and maybe go over them again in a way that you can repeat and understand what you're talking about. And for you to use these directional terms, you always have to have two organs because you can't compare just one thing. Like I cannot say that the heart is superficial. Well, it's superficial to what? I always have to say it's superficial to the kidneys, for example. The kidneys are deep. Okay, so make sure that you're always using two terms like we have here, lungs and pancreas, liver and heart. And then you're going to have one directional term that will define them.